Okay, I suggest we'll start the lecture, and I would like to welcome everybody to this 8th Disability History lecture, which will be presented by our colleague Piet Devos. The Disability History lecture series, maybe some words about this initiative. It is an initiative taken by Professor Piet Devos, who is sitting over there, Professor Patrick de Vlieger, who cannot be here because he is on a sabbatical leave, and myself. And the main aim we have with this series is that we kind of want to promote disability as an academic instrument in order to do research. We have the feeling that a lot of persons actually are doing research with regard to persons with disabilities, but that the concept itself isn't being taken up in order to look at the history, in order to look at the culture, in order to look at, for example, anthropological situations. And so, by means of this series, we'd like to promote disability as an important and a fruitful way of doing academic research. Yeah. Hello. So that is the first thing that we kind of want to promote. A second thing which is important for the three of us is that we kind of want to promote interdisciplinary research. This means that the research we present here and the researchers we give the floor to, they present research that is really interdisciplinary. For example, we had lectures that combined historical with anthropological perspectives. We had presentations that combined cultural perspectives with educational perspectives, etc., etc. We think that this is really an important thing that we should try to promote. And I think this interdisciplinary character is really something that is characteristic for the work of our presenter of today, Piet Devos. Piet Devos has defended his philosophical dissertation at the University of Groningen some years ago already, in 2013. And he mainly is interested in the way, and you have to correct me, Piet, if I'm wrong, but in the way that language and the body language and perception, the senses, interact with each other. That means that he tries to, by making use of literary sources, to retrace the history, if I can say it like that, of the senses, of our human perception. Because we mainly are inclined to see the perception as something that is self-evident, and he tries to problematize that particular thing. I'm very glad that Piet Devos was willing to come to Leuven, because he is almost embarking not on a cargo ship, I think, but on a plane to the other side of the Atlantic. He is going and I have to look at my paper, to the University of Concordia, yes, in Canada, where he will be working as a postdoctoral researcher for 1 year at the Center for Sensory Studies at that university. I really would like to invite you to have a look at the website of Piet Devos, www.pietdevos.be. It's a wonderful website. It's in Dutch, but Piet told me that an English version is on its way. So if you wait for a couple of months, then you'll also be able to find English information about his work, about his life, about his biography. Piet is an excellent researcher. Besides his academic work, Piet is also a translator. He gives public lectures, and he writes really interesting blogs on his website, so please have a look at his digital home space. But for now, I think that is enough. If you would like to add something, Piet, just go ahead. But I would like to give you the floor in order to speak about today's subject, namely the recumbent speaks, the disabled subject, and literary creation between 1900 and 1950. So, Piet, the floor is yours for the next 45 until 50 minutes.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Good afternoon to all of you. It's a great honor for a young researcher like me to be part of this lecture series, which over the past years has welcomed very important disability specialists. So in particular, I owe many thanks to Piet Devos for inviting me and organizing today's event in a very short span of time. I would like to begin my talk by quoting an essay by the famous English author Virginia Woolf. It is a lesser known text by Woolf, published in January 1926, so from Woolf's most productive years. In this essay with the significant title On Being Ill, Woolf criticized the systematic neglect of the body in literary texts. And I quote, "Literature does its best to maintain that its concern is with the mind, that the body is a sheet of plain glass through which the soul looks straight and clear, and save for one or two passions, such as desire and greed, is null, negligible, and non-existent." According to Woolf, such a one-dimensional emphasis on the mind doesn't correspond at all to the reality we live day by day. To treat the body as a transparent sheet of glass is to ignore our basic corporeal condition. And I quote Woolf again, "The creature within can only gaze through the pain, smudged or rosy. It must go through the whole unending procession of changes, heat and cold, comfort and discomfort, hunger and satisfaction, health and illness, until there comes the inevitable catastrophe. The body smashes itself to smithereens." Unquote. We could say that this passage is a quite early example of a critique on the body-mind dualism in Western culture that many theorists would repeat throughout the 20th century. But Woolf raised this point to make a very original argument, because she claimed it was high time that illness became a central theme in literature. As Woolf argued, illness is not only a very common human experience, it also brings about tremendous perceptual and spiritual changes in the affected person. Writing literature concerning illness would help to better grasp these changes and to give them an adequate form of expression and meaning. Woolf formulated this idea as an aesthetic program that still needed to be realized. But as I would like to suggest today, her essay was actually part of a much broader tendency in early 20th century literature that showed a gradual emergence of the disabled subject. What do I exactly mean by this emergence of the disabled subject? I mean that people with chronic diseases and disabilities were less frequently represented in stereotypical ways in literature. No matter whether in the role of character or narrator, these disabled subjects became complex personalities with their own capacities, ambitions, obstacles and dilemmas. We may, for instance, think of the first generation of life writers with disabilities. There are, for example, the celebrated memoirs of the deaf-blind linguist Helen Keller, or Barbelion's Diary of a Disappointed Man from 1919. In this diary, Barbellion reported on his daily struggle with multiple sclerosis. However, I would like to focus on a few other writers who have been largely forgotten, and quite unjustly so, in my opinion. I am referring to the paraplegic Jules Bousquet, to Pablo Palacio, suffering from syphilis, and to the blind Jacques Lucéron. Although their works contained a lot of autobiographical elements, they were not so much concerned with the usual forms of life writing. They rather took their experience with disability as a starting point to develop an unsettling aesthetics and ethics of the body, so more or less in line with the program Woolf proposed in her essay On Being Ill. Yet before delving into these particular case studies, I should tell you a little bit more about my entire research project and the sensory approach I used to study these early 20th century authors. Disability studies is one of those rather recent, innovative fields of research that have made us very much aware of the cultural history of the human body. And the body isn't any stable physical given, but the context-bound product of social practices and cultural meanings. And this basic insight is just as fundamental to the field of research I am coming from, and that is sensory studies, or more specifically, the history of perception. Because historians of perception know too that the ways in which people use and think of their senses change similarly over time and across cultures. In my current research project, I actually try to bring disability and sensory studies together. Because this is one of my central hypotheses that the literary emergence of the disabled subject in the early 1900s was stimulated by a broader cultural interest in alternative modes of perception, including the ones originating from disabilities. There was a gradually growing receptivity, we might say, among Western intellectuals to redefine disability. That is, to no longer reduce disability to sensory lack or a bodily or mental dysfunction, but to understand disability as leading to what we may call a creative reorganization of the complete human sensorium. Where did such receptivity come from? On the practical level, we may think, for instance, of the more systematic schooling of people with disabilities, which would allow some of them at least to participate in the margins of the public and the cultural domains. And we are talking about a very limited number of people, of course, but we shouldn't underestimate how much impact their accounts had as to draw attention to the uncommon perceptual skills resulting from disabilities. A notable example is the work of the Amsterdam-based psychologist Geza Reves, who in the 1930s studied the work of blind sculptors in order to better understand the sense of touch. Yet, as to explain the growing receptivity towards disability, there is one immediate cause which is much more significant in terms of numbers and geographical distribution, and that is the Great War. Because millions of veterans had to live on with traumatized and disabled bodies, just as it gradually groaned on policymakers throughout Europe that they had to reckon with the needs and skills of these groups as to provide the necessary adaptations. Accordingly, the disabled war veteran also appears in all forms of artistic expression, and no wonder that he also will play an important role in my lecture today, particularly in the figure of Jules Bousquet, who got severely wounded at the battlefield in 1918. Meanwhile, we should take into account another early 20th century trend on a more discursive level of science, philosophy, and cultural criticism. What we notice is a widespread rejection of idealist, disembodied models of perception typical of the Enlightenment. As a result of the latest discoveries in physiology, for instance, the body was found to be the very productive site of perception. Visual images, for example, were no longer thought to be objective reflections of external objects on the retina, as rather the product of the nervous communication between the eye and the brain. Sensory perception had lost its status of functioning like a mirror of the external reality. It was now rather conceived of as a psychosomatic language obeying to its own internal structures and laws. Avant-garde artists and writers were very much aware of these new theories regarding perception, and they often integrated them into their own experimental ideas and practices. I have discussed this interaction between art and science at length in my PhD thesis, so I won't repeat it all right now, but I think that this newly subjectivized corporeal definition of perception was really a crucial shift, which created more room for disabled subjects to disclose their outlook on things. Because if it had become impossible to reach sensory objectivity, then we can say that there were only subjective perspectives left, which were all equal, at least epistemologically speaking then. But let us return to Woolf's essay on being ill to make these larger trends a bit more palpable. As you will remember, in the very first quote I cited from her essay, Woolf compared the body to a transparent sheet of glass. This is not just an arbitrary metaphor. On the contrary, because Woolf alludes to the fact that in Western languages and culture we constantly use visual metaphors in relation to knowledge and the mind. You may think of to shed light upon something, a crystal clear argument, darkness equals ignorance, etc. Accordingly, treating the body as the mind's dwelling of glass is to neutralize its constitutive role in knowledge creation, to reduce the body to a mere protective shield of the rational thinker inside. Woolf shatters this glass metaphor so violently because she wants to uncover the carnal grounds of the subject. It is the flesh which binds and unbinds us to the world, just as anyone can tell you who went through the experience of illness. And I quote Woolf again, "When the lights of health go down, the undiscovered countries that are then disclosed, what wastes and deserts of the soul a slight attack of influenza brings to light. What ancient and obdurate oaks are uprooted in us in the act of sickness. How we go down into the pit of death and feel the waters of annihilation close above our heads." Although this passage is not exempt of some irony, Woolf uses strong multisensory images as to evoke the overpowering effect of illness. The sick person feels like descending in darkness and drowning, but also like traveling through unknown deserted lands. In Woolf's text, just like in many other extracts we're going to analyze, there is a notable emphasis on haptics, so on the sense of touch. By haptics, I not only imply the sensations of the skin, so like temperature and water in this passage, but also the sensations of movement and proprioception that inform us concerning our position in real or imaginary space. So like in this passage, descending into the pit of death. These recurrent haptic metaphors and descriptions can be explained by the refined body awareness that authors with disabilities are obliged to develop. As Woolf puts it, and again a quote, "The recumbent," so the person confined to bed, "the recumbent is very familiar with this monster, the body, this miracle." Unquote. Woolf indeed knew very well what she was talking about. She's nowadays mostly remembered as an important innovator of the novel or as an advocate for the rights of female artists. But we tend to forget that she had to cope with multiple disabilities. Not only did she suffer from several nervous breakdowns caused by what nowadays we would call a bipolar disorder, Woolf also had a very poor physical health throughout her lifetime. As the readers of her diaries might recall, long periods of migraine and fever frequently restrained her from working on her novels. Consequently, writing literature on illness seemed very urgent to Woolf. But she also realized that it wouldn't be an easy task to accomplish. Because, first of all, the writer will need, quote, "a new language that is primitive, subtle, sensual, obscene," unquote. It will require new vocabulary, rhetoric, and even genres to render those allegedly disgusting corporeal rhythms and processes of illness visible, audible, and somehow even palpable in language. However, the difficulties were not only a matter of style or technique, because as Woolf pointed out, speaking about these themes would be considered unacceptable and really a violation of the norms in an industrial society obsessed with productivity. The recumbents are confronted with a systematic exclusion, and I quote, "We, the recumbent, cease to be soldiers in the army of the upright. We become deserters. They march to battle." Again, a very significant haptic image in an after-war context. Woolf sets the horizontal position and apparent passivity of the recumbent against the active and upright mobility of soldiers, or, well, the working population in general. She then suddenly reverses the roles by observing that it is the recumbent who, lying on their backs, staring at the clouds drifting across the sky, have access to the most valuable knowledge of all. Because she says, it is only the recumbents who know what, after all, nature is at no pains to conceal, that she in the end will conquer. The recumbents may be treated as outsiders, but they actually have so much wisdom to share with those docile citizens who, disciplined and mobilized, go on marching without asking any single question. Because the recumbent have come to experience the fragility and rebellious nature of the human body. The mortal flesh that illusory promises of economic progress and military power try to conceal. In short, Woolf thus proposed a literary aesthetics that was firmly rooted in the uncontrollable physicality of the body, whose disabilities so often resist social norms and categorization. Such an aesthetics was undoubtedly in line with her contemporaries' increasing interest in the subject's incarnation, but it was exceptional, not to say revolutionary, by aiming at the recognition of disabilities as an integral part of human existence. But how would an aesthetics of disability look like in practice? Well, to begin with, we could trace this aesthetics back into the recurrent character of the disabled war veteran in literary texts from the 1920s and 30s. Literature is probably the art form through which we get the deepest insights in another person's consciousness. So literature served as an important cultural tool to bring these veterans' uncomprehended suffering into the open. Right now, we could discuss the staggering portrait which Woolf in her novel Mrs. Dalloway provides of a veteran named Septimus Smith. Septimus is a completely traumatized young man who, when he returns from the trenches, but he doesn't receive any help except for being labeled as shell-shocked, and ultimately dies a lonesome, untimely death. Or we could discuss an example which is still much closer to us, Gerard Walschap's novel Celibaat, Celibacy, from 1934. This novel tells the story of a country gentleman who, out of boredom, decides to volunteer for military service. Once an aristocrat, he finally returns home as one of those nameless and faceless victims of modern warfare, literally, because his face has been totally destroyed. He has to spend the rest of his days behind an iron mask. I would like to focus on a non-fictional veteran who refused to see his disability as a condemnation to such an anonymous misery, and that is Jules Bousquet. Born in the southern French Haute department in 1897, Bousquet didn't have any artistic aspirations before the outbreak of the war. Called up for military service, he distinguished himself as a courageous commander for his unit, but seemed to be rather careless if it came to his own life. It is even said that he wore red boots at the battlefield. All the same, the fatal moment came rather late in the war, on the 27th of May 1918, during the Battle of VIII, when a German bullet crushed Bousquet's vertebral column. The injury would forever leave him paraplegic, even though in the subsequent years Bousquet tried all kinds of medical treatments and rehabilitation exercises. Those were also the years when Bousquet discovered avant-garde art, and particularly the Surrealist movement. It was the Surrealist celebration of the boundless imagination which showed him the way to his own literary creativity. He became the close friend of many famous Surrealists like Paul Éluard and Max Ernst, and signed their first manifesto in 1924. It is not so surprising then that there are some affinities between Surrealism and Bousquet's own writings. But Bousquet also felt that he needed to carry out his own aesthetic project in accordance with his singular bodily condition. Let me point out three major components of this project that would turn out to be his lifelong engagement. That is, first, the wound as event; two, the depersonalizing act of writing; and three, the space of immobility. First of all, we should take into account that the wound runs as a trace through Bousquet's extensive literary oeuvre. That is because from a very early stage on, he interpreted this wounding as nothing less than a second birth, his birth as a disabled person as much as a writer. Both sides of his post-1918 identity are very much intertwined, as he explains in the following entry from his diary, Traduit du silence, so translated from silence. Yeah, and talking about silence, these are my own English renderings of the French original, so my apologies for any non-idiomatic construction. So I quote Bousquet. He says, "I will have exerted all my forces to naturalize the accident of which my youth has been the victim. I wanted that it ceased to be exterior to me, and that my intellectual and moral activities were its necessary continuation. As if, in a completely restored existence, I would be able to erase the material character inherent to the accident, to eliminate from my thoughts the impression that a coincidence managed to weigh me down, without making any distinction between my life and that of things." For Bousquet, creating his own aesthetics served to integrate the wound into a meaningful narrative. He aimed at transforming the mere material coincidence of a bullet hitting human flesh into an event with intrinsic value, a destiny. Consequently, he used to say that the wound existed before him, so that he was born to incarnate it. It was not so much his disability as such which he refused to accept. It was rather a certain conception of disability as an exclusively bodily fact which he repudiated. Let me again highlight the haptic metaphors in the long passage I have just quoted. Bousquet speaks of the weight of materiality that threatens to keep him down in the realm of dead things. He realized that this weight would never disappear, nor would the pain that had become a constant companion. But he could lift this weight and make the pain lighter if they were turned into the catalyst of a self-imposed metamorphosis. For Bousquet, this metamorphosis meant to leave behind the singular individual who had died at the battlefield of VIII in order to become an emblematic figure of life's force and resilience. And I quote Bousquet himself again, "I am someone who saw within himself how his being survived the man's death. Yes, after a horrible accident, my life has taken the appropriate form to replace me." To understand what is implied by that form replacing me, we need to consider a second component of Bousquet's aesthetics, and that is the depersonalizing act of writing. So please keep in mind that for Bousquet, writing wasn't a free choice, that it felt like a necessity, a destiny imposed by the wound. But thanks to this very same writing, he was able to give an almost transcendental, sublimated form to personal desires. As regards his relation with women, for example, he no longer wanted to dream of sexual intercourse. impotent as he was, and reconceived love in poetic and mystical terms. As we read again in his diary, and I quote, "The act of writing is a joy for me, the only possible way to come closer to her, whom no one ever encounters in this world." So it's kind of talking about a mystical lover. We might wonder whether such depersonalization is ever realizable for a human being. In Bousquet's case too, we see that, well, his hurting, sensuous body always calls him back from the high spiritual flights. All the same, his longing for depersonalization remains at the heart of his struggle with and through writing. As a result, his rich oeuvre doesn't consist of straightforward autobiographical narratives, but rather consists of fragmentary novels, diaries, and reflections centered on the mysterious figure of le poète couché, so the recumbent poet. If writing constituted the most crucial form to render Bousquet's disabled existence meaningful, he discovered still another form in designing an aestheticized space of immobility to live in. I'm referring to his darkened room in the huge house in Carcassonne, where he spent more than 25 years without almost any interruption, until his death in 1915. Many of Bousquet's friends and admirers described their visits to this room with shuttered windows, as the whole experience made such an indelible impression on them. First, one had to climb a high, majestic staircase and walk through a long corridor to reach a door, giving access to an antichambre that was separated from Bousquet's own room by a heavy curtain. Many witnesses commented that entering the room through this curtain, enveloped by the scent of opium which Bousquet often smoked, was like entering a sanctuary. Only then they would discern the author lying in bed, surrounded by books and papers close at hand and surrealist paintings on the walls. As one of his friends would later on report, and I quote, "There, outside of time, in the dark, was a radiation of peace, claimed from the most horrifying defeats." It is probably not adequate to interpret this space as staging a performance, because Bousquet didn't design it for the sake of public effect. Meanwhile, it is beyond any doubt that this space had a disorienting, even disabling impact on the visitors. On the one hand, it drew them into the imprisonment of the paraplegic body. On the other hand, it urged them to set aside their day-to-day worries as to transcend in the poetic domain of beauty. Taken together, these three components, so the narrative of the wounds, the act of writing, and the space of immobility, make Bousquet's aesthetics into a very profound reflection on his being reborn with a disability, on the suffering such an experience entails, as well as its creative potential. Let us now move on to the next case study to comment upon another key aspect of disabled subject in literature, and that is the development of an appropriate style. Style is so much more than a way of speaking. It is not a matter of choosing at random tropes, vocabulary, register, etc. As the earlier example of Wool's glass metaphor has suggested, the adoption or rejection of particular stylistic elements have epistemological or even ideological consequences. To a certain extent, a writer's style will be determined by his or her position within a society and a literary tradition. But his or her style is also the principal tool to resist dominant trends and to claim new grounds. So in the case of disability, the main question is whether or not one's style subscribes to the able-bodied norm. In the 20s and 30s, this question was raised by the works of the Ecuadorian writer Pablo Palacio. Although we know that Palacio must have contracted syphilis at a young age, probably still a university student. We do not dispose of any autobiographical accounts on this lurking disease that would ultimately lead to his mental collapse in the 1940s. Instead, Palacio left us with a very fascinating collection of short stories and 2 novellas, in which all kinds of abnormal bodies appear as protagonists. To illustrate the importance of style, I'd like to focus on one of these short stories entitled La doble y única mujer, so the double and single woman from 1927. The first-person narrator of this story are female twins conjoined at the back, so she has 2 heads, 4 arms and 4 legs. In spite of the apparent duality within her body, the narrator insists that she is but one person, having a first eye and a second eye. This is how she, it is always the first eye who speaks, recounts the constitution of this exceptional identity. And once again, this is my own translation of the original. I have to explain the origin of this direction, which place me in front at the head of I, her. It was the only conflict between my views which authorizes me here, and only here, to speak about us instead about me, because it was the only moment when each of us, as soon as she was capable of walking, wanted to go her own way. Due to atavism, I guess, please note, she who is by now second eye, wanted to go like all people, looking at where they are going. I wanted to do the same, looking at where I was going, so that an energetic jostling was the result, and on a steady basis, given that we were in the position of a 4-footed animal. Finally, I succeeded in overpowering her, lifting her up with a jerk and dragging her along. My triumph led between us to an incontestable superiority of my first part over my second part, and constituted the unity of which I have spoken. In this passage, the narrator obviously struggles with the use of personal pronouns and verbal forms, given that she has to refer to herself at once in singular and in plural. Her identity, produced by the movement and proprioception of an extraordinary body, breaks the normalizing rules of language. Because these rules tend to force the chaos of subjective thoughts and sensations into the templates of a clear-cut individuality, with the pronoun I usually designating one normal mind and body. Consequently, the witty narrator apologizes to both linguists and moralists for violating all their norms throughout her narrative. Yet, she needs this disruptive style, not only to reinforce her proprioceptive self-awareness, so to define her front, back, first and second eye, but she also needs this style to oppose to her social exclusion. This exclusion results in particular from the authoritative discourse of doctors and teratologists who treat her like a curiosity, reducing her to being the double monster. That's a quote. The narrator gives an ironic twist to this power relation when she reveals the intimate friendship of her mother with the doctor at the time of her own conception. Moreover, during the subsequent pregnancy, this doctor provided her mother with drawings representing all kinds of monstrous creatures, which, according to popular legend, might have influenced the fetus's form through the mother's imagination. Palacio's narrator thus suggests that medicine produces the very monsters which it later on pretends to cure. More in general, what can be said about the doctor's creations of monsters in this story could also be applied to the great majority of Palacio's contemporaneous critics. These critics often reacted in disgust to his writings, classifying them as belonging to the genre of the grotesque or as gratuitous avant-garde experiments. They didn't see, or didn't want to see, that a story like The Double and Single Woman uncovers the violent social processes aiming at the correction of so-called abnormal bodies. It should be noted that Palacio's charge against normalization was not only applicable to Ecuadorian society. As Margaret Childrick has convincingly shown, especially the figure of the conjoined twin has since long embodied one of the monstrous others in our Western imagination. As Childrick points out, this is due to the fact that conjoined twins so overtly contradict our ideal of an inviolable self-body that is secure, distinct, closed and autonomous. In The Double and Single Woman, Palacio gave this monster not only a very human voice, but through this voice also a sensuous body with its own desires and pains in an inaccessible and hostile environment. Still more important, and more shocking probably for scandalized critics at the time, is the way in which this lady presents herself as a self-secure yet divided subject. And I quote again, "Between me," the first time that "between me" has been written down, "there exists a center where there is a constant flow and reflow of all spiritual phenomena, or unknown material and mental states, just as you prefer." So thanks to a transgressive style, Palacio's narrator is able to articulate a form of subjectivity in which the self and the other always coexist in an incessant interaction. What society calls a monstrous disabled body is for her own perception the between me, that is, an intensely felt mode of being and speaking. To complete the picture of the emerging disabled subject in literature, we also need to study this subject's claim to personal ethics. No doubt that ethical consideration also plays a significant part in the works of Bousquet and Palacio, but they never put as much emphasis on ethics as a blind author Jacques Lucéron. So indeed, this last case study takes us back to France and to a later generation, because Lucéron was born in 1924. In the 1950s and 60s, Lucéron would achieve quite some fame, mainly as a result of his extraordinary deeds during the Second World War. Still a teenager, he had been one of the founders and coordinators of a resistance network in Paris. Subversive activities for which he was deported to Buchenwald in 1944. What is most remarkable is that in his autobiographical texts about those tumultuous years, Lucéron never ascribed the impetus for his acts to any doctrine or ideology, but to an inner experience of intensely shining light. He maintained that it was a discovery of this light only a few days after an accident had caused his sudden blindness at the age of 8, which had opened up a never-drying source of inspiration and courage. How should we understand this experience of inner vision, which taught Lucéron the most fundamental ethical values? As Lucéron himself describes it, having lost his eyesight, he was plunged into a continuous stream of mental images, never ceasing to pop up spontaneously wherever he went or whoever he met. Accordingly, it was clear from the outset that this inner projection of colors and images wasn't at all a mere reenactment of visual memories. Yet, as he himself explained, the depicted scenes inside his head were not entirely realistic either. For example, his collection of essays entitled Le Monde commence aujourd'hui, The World Begins Today, contains a moving portrayal of a friend of Lucéron, a Parisian painter called Jean. Lucéron considered Jean to be an exceptionally gifted observer, so that he was used to seeing his friend as wearing a hat of radiant light. Furthermore, Lucéron didn't conceive of his inner vision as strictly visual. For him, it rather had a multisensory nature, and I quote, Inside me, every sound, every scent, and every shape was forever changing into light, and light itself changing into color to make a kaleidoscope of my blindness. It is as if the light shone through Lucéran's entire body, uniting all his senses into a synesthetic organ resonating with his surroundings. Or to put it differently, light felt for him like an all-encompassing element forging reciprocal bonds between his own body and the world around. In his writings, we can distinguish at least three basic values which Lucéran drew from this intimacy with the light. And that is 1, openness, 2, the joy of sharing, and 3, purity. To begin with openness, Lucéran often underlined that his experience of light was not always as overwhelming. It grew brighter as soon as he was filled with happiness, but it likewise darkened with anger or sadness. In other words, the experience of light was dependent on his own emotional state, and, more profoundly, on the degree of attentiveness which this emotional state entailed. The more unconditional his receptivity became, the clearer all things appear to him. In short, we notice how the perceptual interdependence of subject and object gains ethical value here. It is the observer's own openness which makes the world come to meet him, so to speak. Strikingly enough, Lucéran once wrote that in essence, perception is always one of touch. So between himself and the world. To be sure, such an attentiveness is already difficult to maintain in daily life. But what if the external circumstances become life-threatening? This brings us to the second ethical value of joy and a most astonishing episode of Lucéran's autobiography, and that is his captivity in the concentration camp Buchenwald. Upon his arrival in Buchenwald in January 1944, like any other prisoner, Lucéran too was paralyzed when confronted with the endless atrocities and omnipresence of death in the camp. But he gradually learned how to survive by not sticking to self-pity or to hatred towards the Germans. Lucéran came to realize that there isn't anything like a fixed personal identity. Those prisoners who kept on nourishing that identity and memories from the past had almost no chance to survive in the lager, according to Lucéran. Instead, through friendship and other signs of basic human warmth and creativity, Lucéran got again in touch with the indestructible light, this eternal source of life, as he by then called it. It was as if he was sharing in a non-personal joy of still being alive. Lucéran would ultimately integrate this precious lesson within a psychological model. He described this model in what would turn out to be his final lecture from 1971, entitled Against the Pollution of the Eye. So now we reach the third value of purity. Within the human psyche, Lucéran discerned two conflicting forces. On the one hand, there is the superficial ego, and on the other, the profound I. This latter force, so the I, represents one's inborn acquaintance with the eternal source of life. But this I is very weak nowadays and needs purification, because it is the ego, with its insatiable desire for things, money and social prestige, which reigns supreme in the modern cult of the individual. According to Lucéran, the ego is being reinforced by a strictly instrumental use of the senses, especially of the eyes, leading to the idolatry of images and ephemeral surface values. However, the text is not so explicit on how the eye should be purified from the pernicious influences of the ego. All the same, it is clear that Lucéran was transforming his personal experience of inner light into a cultural critique with universalizing ethical pretensions. He was turning blindness into a source of wisdom from which all sighted people could eventually learn. But he couldn't further explore this line of thought due to his tragic death in a car crash shortly before delivering this lecture in Switzerland. Well, time to wrap up. Throughout this lecture I've tried to sketch the outlines of the emergence of the disabled subject in early 20th century literature. As we've seen, it's a complex process involving theoretical reflections, as we saw in the case of Woolf, strategies of auto-representation, like in Bousquet, stylistic innovation, Palacio, and ethical revaluation, Lucéron. Yet what I've told is but a part of the story, because I've restricted my analysis mainly to the close reading of these authors' own works, as to show their immense richness. But we definitely need a better understanding of how such literary texts interacted with the broader discursive representation of people with disabilities. To what extent did these authors revise the predominant depiction of disabled people in science, philosophy, or popular culture? Cases like Palacio's conjoined twins suggest that such a revision was indeed underway, but this question ought to be studied in much more detail, according to me. Furthermore, a similar cultural historical framing is a necessary step to avoid the classic trap of the exceptional individual's narratives. Biographers tend to portray authors like Bousquet and Lucéron as figures who were bigger than life. But it is only by analyzing their writings within a comparative and cultural historical framing that we will surpass their individual significance. This is also the reason why I decided to describe several divergent cases today, and not to comment upon, for example, the style and the ethics of disability in the works of just one single author. In this manner, it has hopefully become clear that authors coping with very different types of impairments and working within very diverse cultural settings were equally concerned with the disclosure of the disabled subject. Disability was not only a life-changing event for them, they also drew attention to its potential contribution to culture at large. And remember the recumbent having access to a kind of atemporal knowledge and beauty which the army of the upright tends to forget. Meanwhile, especially in the texts by Woolf and Palacio, we have traced an increasing resistance against the social processes of exclusion and normalization to which disabled people were being subjected. Even Lucéron, who celebrated blindness as his greatest gift in life, wrote extensively about his most bitter disappointment when, after returning from Buchenwald, he wasn't allowed to teach in France for many years. That was due to law from the Vichy regime, prohibiting people with disabilities to enter in public service. A law which would only be abolished in 1958, so 13 years after the war. Finally, the sensory approach has helped to discover metaphorical and stylistic patterns underlying the literary representation of disabilities. All these authors developed an acute body awareness, resulting in a strong emphasis on the many layers of touch, ranging from pain and immobility in Woolf and Bousquet to the articulation of an uncommon proprioceptive organization in Palacio's conjoined twins. In Lucéron, even the light became haptic, as it is the all-encompassing element in which subject and world meet. Disabled subjectivity seems to lean, at least in this period, on an epistemology of touch, and in Lucéron's case, even ontology. The direct experience with the body's capricious and fragile nature is one explanation, but it could also be ascribed to the intensified consciousness regarding interpersonal contacts of disabled people, the reliance on friends or caregivers, but also the physical interaction within an inaccessible environment. To finish, let me stress that, well, what I've presented today is still very much work in progress. None of these case studies has been finished yet. Two very concrete goals for my upcoming research stay at the Center for Sensory Studies in Montreal is first the further exploration of this interconnection between disabled subjectivity and haptics, and two, the framing of these literary texts within a secondary corpus consisting of non-literary representations of disabilities from the same period. So the next hour I will be very happy to receive all your questions, suggestions, critical observations. But first I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nuanced and, according to me, thought-provoking presentation. The floor is now open for questions from our side. Does anyone have a question for Piet? Yeah?
I during his lecture, I was thinking about one question, and I think he gave, I don't know if it's if he can give an answer to it, but well, it's a very informative lecture, and through which we know that literature is a vehicle through which disabled people can articulate their resistance and also have a voice on their disability. Mm-hmm. And the main characteristic is that their disability is the impetus for their writings. So through this literature from Virginia Woolf, which was, according to the lecturer, was frail and she was unconscious from time to time, I'm not sure. And also because of the other Jules Bousquet, who was paralyzed. So they all had literature, autobiographies, novels, in order to articulate the resistance of the social construction of disability. My question is there any other vehicle other than literature through which these disabled people can have a voice and can resist the other?
Yeah, well, thanks. I am thinking about the same. In the same period, there are certainly there should be other examples of other artists with disabilities or non-disabled artists who worked with the theme of disability. Like, for example, there are certainly more, but I'm thinking about the surrealists who were very fascinated by all kinds of psychic disease and disabilities, and they really made serious study of it. I mean, they often say, yeah, it was just a fascination to oppose rationalism, and that's of course one of their themes. They were very opposed to Western rationalism, but there is a text, for example, where Breton and Éluard, I'm again talking about literature, I'm realizing now. But anyway, they mimic all kinds of psychic disabilities and try to write as people with a certain psychic disease would have written a text. And this text has been studied by psychiatrists, and apparently it is rather it's very striking how close they are to what it's so that's again literature, but of course the surrealists were also painters, etc., and there is certainly lots of connection there with mental disabilities. I am not so sure because I am mainly a literary scholar. So maybe someone else knows more or can think of more examples from the same periods.
Let me just jump in. Hi, I'm Thomas. Actually, I think taking on the same point, I think you can use the same writings that Piet nicely described. I mean, you can use the same cases. I mean, these are experiences, lived bodies, but explained through their writings. But the writing is only serving as the explanation of their lived reality, which was a way of opposing the so-called normal way of living of that time. I mean, their life itself, their profession, what they did, like Lucero, his activity, his resistance. And also there, like other people, like you mentioned, being a teacher, he was not allowed to taught in the beginning for many years. I mean, that's one of the way they opposed the disabled body, how they should be working and operating. I mean, so.
Yeah, there is, I think, so resistance is one thing, explanation is another, and I think what is also important here is to see the performativity of language as well. So, I mean, it's not only kind of describing or resisting and to bring it in the open, it's also to make it palpable. Why all these very strong images in Woolf's text is also to get a glimpse of this experience of sickness, when you really feel like drowning and etc., that you're kind of overwhelmed by the whole experience, and of course Woolf is also the first to draw attention to the fact that the body resists linguistic representation. So she says, okay, there is this very experience of pain which goes against speaking, which in the end is the only thing you know. There's only the pain left. They are very much aware of that, but it's still like we certainly see in the case of Palacio, where he uses this very experimental style to make this subject speak and to give her a body, etc. So to kind of it's more than explaining. It's really trying to make the reader enter this body somehow. Of course, there is always the mediation of language there, but it's a way to try that.
What struck me a little bit in your talk, Piet, and I think it connects to the both questions, is that you focused a lot on the way the body is represented in the text, and how things like haptic issues are very prominent in those literary productions. But as a side effect, according to me, is you kind of lose sight of the actual bodies of those disabled subjects. And I think it has to do with the question you were posing. Of course, the disabled subject try to express their voices by means of language, but at the same time they also did so by making use of their bodies, by going on the streets and marching. For example, you had disabled veterans who marched to London. You had blinded veterans who marched to London in order to plea for some rights, for some indemnation, you say that?
Like compensation? Or
compensation. So that was a kind of feeling I had while listening to your talk. So I'm not sure whether the impression is correctly, but.
Well, I am not so sure about that. But I of course here that's maybe the difference between a historian and a literary scholar. I am working with literature, so that's my but that's really But it's not to because I think it's a crucial argument. It's important because, as I say, I didn't. I still have to look into this cultural historical context more in detail, etc. But still, I'm mainly interested in that will be always the protagonist of my new book will be literary authors and how they talk about disability. So it's very important to take this cultural context into, and for example, what you now say, this manifestation of war veterans. These are important facts to take along as a literary scholar. I certainly agree. But I'm not writing cultural history about disability in this period. No, I'm writing about how it's represented and thought through in language, in literature, to be particular. And what interests me here is exactly this, because you say the body is way there, but what these writers exactly emphasized was that they were bringing the body in. And so that's interesting, that we are, I think it's also our perspective a bit, that we are used to literary tradition, artistic tradition from the late, let's say now beginning 21st century, where the body is very present. And of course, it's also present in earlier representations, obviously. But to make it the real, to make the subject speak, to make it, this whole chaos of the body shown in the texts, that's very modernist. To be inside the subject and to feel this complete chaos, and that's not only for disabilities, of course. James Joyce's Ulysses, two people walking through the streets. You're only inside their heads, so you don't get out of their head. You don't know what is objective truth there. There's a stream of consciousness. That's a new practice in that period, and I think that this is new, and this is to make somehow, this body. Because you're always dealing with mediation, of course, language is there.
Yes.
But it's, where does the body come in then?
So perhaps just for making it a bit clearer for myself, is there a difference for you? So you say they bring the body in. What would you say to me if I would say to you, they are not bringing the body in, they are bringing the representation of the body in? Is there a difference between the two? And
yes.
If so, is that important for the argument that you are making?
Yes, I think there is, because they were really drawing on I don't know your name, but you asked the first question, already said they were triggered by their own disabled experience often, so they were very acquainted with it. And it's not to say that it's a one-to-one representation, because not all these writers worked in a very autobiographical way. But still, this experience with this body was a trigger, and to make it to see the cultural importance of this experience and to bring it into their novels. I mean, especially someone like Woolf, who was at the time already a very important author, who was already celebrated, writing for the Times, etc. So she was a seen figure. She was a public figure, and still in her novels we find many references to illness, to disability. So she had a strong voice to make that audible. So yes, I would say that it really makes a difference that this interests. Because even because the question is also the other side. If you if you say, okay, literature is only about representation, to a certain degree it is only representation, sure, but that's with every historical fact and text the case. So that's the whole discussion then. How do we get to the bodily experience from the past? That's a hard one, and it's a very crucial one for both for history of disabilities, I think, and perception, and how do we do that? What if so the disabled subject is maybe not in this literature then, but how do we get at it? Is a representation? I mean, if you you study, I don't know, newspapers, representation of disabled people in newspapers. Are you closer to the disabled body then? That's my very question. What I do think is that we have to see literature, and that's where I'm very much away of the traditional, and that's a little bit misrepresented maybe in my lecture today, because I focused on the writers themselves. But in my book, in my articles, I always try to show the interaction between literature and other kinds of discourses and other kinds of representations, etc. So to show that literature is not one discourse It is interacting with philosophy, with journalism, with whatever, name it, and literature is doing something with it. And I think this is also important because, it can do a lot to revise or to rethink certain experiences, in this case disability.
Yes.
That's...
Suhaila, you wanted to react?
I have a follow-up question. According to question you said, is it haptics?
Yes.
Do the writers bring the body in or the representation in? And we have to bear in mind that these writers that you have talked about were, between inverted commas, they were normal people and then became disabled, which means that they had a sense of other perceptions. Then would we talk, if we have a person who were disabled, born disabled, then would we talk then of representation of haptics or another kind of haptics then?
No, I think, but of course, let's be clear about that. Haptics and the structure I have proposed there, skin proprioception, is an afterward, is a construction, is a model, is taken from historians of perception and philosophers of perception. It's a useful model to describe the sense of touch, which we often lack terms to describe it. We only think the body is touches only the skin, but it's so much more. Merleau-Ponty, the philosopher, says movement is the light of touch. So we need movement to touch. For example, but anyway, so this is a model. It's something you will never find in these authors themselves. What you find is their references to many sensations of the body, and which you can analyze through this model. So haptics is a model which you can. It's a whole scale of experiences we covered by that. So able-bodied, disabled, doesn't matter. It's haptics as a kind of that's it. It's not more than that. So you can also, haptics, some authors will define it differently. So I know, for example, in psychology that haptic is narrower, that it's not only the sense of, that it's less than how I define it here. So this is a conceptual problem, but I think it's in general a way to specify our thinking of perception and embodiment. This kind of terms which are useful but also vague. So that's why.
I think let me just go back into the idea of haptics, and the professor was talking about the body speaking or body representing. I think looking at the authors you describe in their autobiographies, I think the narratives of the disabled body, it represents both the body speaking and body representing. I mean, representing in the sense of there is the challenge of the existing so-called normal body. That's the representative part. On the other hand, the haptic model which Piet is talking about, it not only makes the body speak, which is outside the realm of the normal body. So a disabled person is basically making his body speak. The body is speaking here as a body which is not normally accepted. But from the point of a model, theoretical model, which is talking about, we can see this haptic body of the disabled body as a representation of a body outside the normal discourse of representation of the body.
I think that's indeed that's also a complicated one indeed. Which body is exactly here speaking? So that's also why I'm very careful about, even in autobiographies. There is autobiographies. Maybe you're familiar with the autobiographical pact between. So if we read an autobiography, we tend to take that there is like a pact between the author and the reader, that he is going to present himself as he is. That is very authentic. That is the truth. And it's clear that this is a construction, and he uses all kinds of rhetoric tricks to convince us of this, and that's exactly the same with every disabled subject as well. So they will be as authentic as they, even unconsciously, but still it's a construction. So we have to take care there. So indeed, about which body are they speaking? Some are clearly speaking about fictional characters, like in the case of Palacio with the conjoined twins. In the case of Luceron, of course, he is very, he presents himself as a very authentic writer. So that's different in depending on the case study. So also there we have to make a difference. But also this, indeed, if you make a comparison, like I try to do, and I notice this strong emphasis on haptics. Of course, as I say, it's work in progress, so I'm not sure whether that will still be in my book in a few years, but it's apparently there. Then still what is interesting is that it's a way of thinking, a haptic way of thinking, we could say, very embodied, very with this very emphasis on carnal sensations, is indeed an interesting new way of perception in comparison to the strong emphasis on vision in Western culture. And apparently in this period, my previous book was on perception in avant-garde art. And there you see a little bit the same. You see that the classical, the enlightened model of the visual observer is being questioned. You know, you can think about cubism, where you have this various perspectives. So you're away from the steady one perspective. So that's already a questioning of the stable, let's say, visual subject. But there is surrealism, for example, where you even see much more emphasis on the body, eroticism, violence, whatever. So apparently disability is a bit taking part of this. And I think that the authenticity claims of many disabled people are exactly relying on these haptic metaphors. They show, okay, this is my body. It is my body which speaks. It is my body which hurts. It is my body I feel. And this is what I'm trying to convey through my narrative. So I think that the authenticity in this autobiographical writing is exactly constructed through, or is important. I don't know, it's not the only way, but an important tool to do that is haptics, haptic language. But once again, it's work in progress, so I'm not sure. It's what I found till now.
Kat, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, I'm Kat Wils, coming from cultural history, and that probably explains also, or gives some background to my question. Do you see a connection between the emergence of the disabled subject, as you have presented it within a more modernist context, and romantic notions of disability as an element, a sign of, and even a condition of geniality? The whole idea of blindness as something you need to see well, but also within the history of science, the whole idea of the topos of the sick scientist. Which is so important in Western ideas about knowledge and what it is to be a real scholar, a very gendered idea. That's another theme you didn't touch upon. But so do you see that as a continuum, that this modernist emergence of the disabled subject is just another chapter in a longer history, or do you think it is something substantially different?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, because this can indeed, I indeed really think that it's a much longer process. If you describe this kind of shifts in perception or ideas about perception in the body, I think then it's really, you're talking about trends, maybe dominant trends and maybe resistance as well. So of course you're also talking about here about avant-garde writers mainly. So this is even not representative of very popular writers at the time. So That's
No,
one.
but this part of popular representation is also about what it is to be a scientist. It is to be ready to be sick, to suffer from what you're doing.
Yeah. Well,
that has been a very popular.
Yeah. Well, so that's a very interesting idea. Of course, with Romanticism, what I indeed think the connection is certainly there from modernism to Romanticism is exactly this strong emphasis on the subjective gaze and the subjective perspective. It's actually the Kantian turn, which you see then in art and in literature, and so very much the idea of you're an exceptional observer. You see things which others do not see.
Yeah.
And this figure of the seer, but this is not only typical, that's what intrigues me so in these writers with disabilities, because it's a trope, this exceptional observer, which I also traced in non-disabled authors.
Yes, definitely.
And so what are they doing? Are they, let's say, going along with this trend, or are they kind of claiming their own grounds there? And that's a bit what I'm thinking now. First as a subject, that's also important, first as a subject, while the other writers often as a group. Here as a subject, as one person. But later on you also see like Lucéran and so on, he also takes on at some points the I'm talking for all the blind, and this kind of rhetoric. So there I certainly agree there is a link with Romanticism. Sure, and this link with science could also be a very interesting one. I know less about that, I have to say, but
you have the idea that you have to suffer to be a true scientist, and that the suffering is in the first place a bodily.
Suffering.
Is it following up on your question? I mean, you refer to the sick scientist, and you also mentioned sickness, but at the same time you were talking about disability. Is there a kind of tension between sickness and disability? Because there are a lot of scholars who say, okay, you have sickness like AIDS, you have leprosy, and any other sickness that we can come up with. But on the other hand, you have disability, and this is really a different thing.
Well, is it? Yeah, it depends. I really think that this is really a matter of definition. For example, if you look at the text by Woolf, for example, she doesn't use the term disability. It's maybe also a much modern, more modern term, but she clearly kind of implies both. And but it's true that this is a question that I will have to address, because all these authors, they will often redefine or define the whole category of disability differently. So that's a difficult one. But as now, I would use it as a rather descriptive term, in let's say, rather broad concept, let's say bringing disease, chronic disease, and disability together. But I understand that some will oppose to that.
Yeah, but I think disability, we know it's a modern term. I mean, it mostly emerged with the idea of compensating people who suffer, largely from the effects of war, and it's for economic employment and insurance, all this kind of that. It's basically a very modern term. But I think in relation to disability and sickness as such, it's a continuum basically.
That's indeed.
And talking to the idea of a sick scientist, I mean that's kind of a romantic notion, but I mean they have different roles they play as a scientist or earlier times or today. I mean today in a medicalized society, I think sick scientists will not be given much credibility, right?
No, that's interesting, because then you.
I mean, it's not disappeared.
I know it's not, but the discourse has, dominant discourse has shifted.
Yeah, but that's again what's so interesting about this, that you have to be so careful about this concept that it shifts all the time. That exactly this the whole thing of, well, as we just say, perception is just the same. That if you're talking about touch in the beginning of 20th century, it's not exactly what we think of it today, or what we know about it today in physiological terms, etc.
one last
Yeah,
question.
yeah, go ahead.
During your lecture, you said a phrase that attracts me, which is writing is a necessity. When you were describing
Bousquet.
the case, yeah.
Mhm.
And then I started wondering whether writing, the act of writing, is a reconciliation with the new disabled self.
Yes, I think that's a nice way of putting it. Yes, for Bousquet it was reinventing himself. It was giving himself new existence in writing. And of course, I think that some readers would see as if you read Bousquet as a very negative response to disability, in the sense that he creates this aestheticized space to live in. He will write and no longer so he never leaves his room. It may seem a little bit very passive kind of life he is, and many people with the same disability would say, well, it's just he's really making anything of his life. He's just very passive. But for him, it was his aesthetic project, and it's let's say from a historical point of view, it's very interesting, and it is indeed a kind of reconciliation. Yes. Because for him it was, he wasn't a writer beforehand, so it was really after, it was the only thing he could do, according to himself, to survive, to make sense of his life.
Can I go back to the very beginning of your presentation,
please.
To the hypothesis that you enumerated in order to get an answer to why this disabled subject emerged all of a sudden at the beginning of the, well, perhaps not all of a sudden, but emerged at the beginning of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is, and you mentioned disabled people's access to education and culture.
Yeah.
And from the point of the history of education, I kind of would like to question that hypothesis, because people with disabilities have criticized precisely the education they got. Why? Because it did not lead to the emancipatory processes they were looking for. Like, for example, persons who cannot hear, deaf people, they criticized the education they got enormously, because it oppressed them.
Yeah.
And so I think that you need to refine this hypothesis, because it's formulated a bit too... Yeah,
it's maybe too about what I
too
think...
positive, I would say.
It is maybe too positive, yeah, that's what... But I think that what you say and what I want to imply do not exclude each other. What I think is, because the point is, there was a kind of interest, what I notice is an interest in the perceptual skills of people with disabilities, and that is not at all anything about emancipation. I think that this is the next step, and which is certainly not at stake then, in the sense of, full participation in culture. That's a very gradual process, and it's certainly not. I'm thinking about, for example, Merleau-Ponty, because phenomenology I didn't discuss here, but it's an important tradition to draw attention to the disabled experience of perception. Merleau-Ponty includes a lot of references to disability and disabled perception. And he's very much interested in that, because this can inform him about the norm. How is normal perception? You can question this, of course, as a gesture, how he works. But that's how it goes. And it often is like this, that many scientists are interested in, for example, deaf people are very important about in the research of Katz and Reves on the sense of touch, because they know a lot about the sense of vibration, how they experience music. And then you see that these scientists refer time and quite a lot to disabled subjects, not to say, this is their special way, no, to say, look, there is a sense of vibration. We have it, but we are not aware of it.
But I'm not sure whether I follow, because I
Yeah.
thought that the hypothesis here had to do with the opening up of education for persons with disabilities, not the
No.
fact that they entered.
No, sorry. No, it's more the hypothesis was that, you know, that there is, that the interest in disability has lots to do with growing interest in alternative modes of perception. That's
Okay.
my hypothesis, that more in general,
Okay.
there is this idea of this subjectivized perception. And so then I wonder, okay, but why disability? How did they
Yes.
get access to the knowledge of these people? And then I see that, for example, Helen Keller is often quoted by these scientists. So then you may think, all right, so their writings really reached some scientists.
Yes.
And for example, Geza Reves, whom I mentioned, did serious research with blind sculptors.
Okay, so it's an indirect consequence.
Yeah, sorry.
Of-
Yeah, that's maybe just
okay.
not so clear on my
Okay.
handout, or
Yes.
it's
I can follow you now.
Yeah, it's more like a kind of thinking of, well, how did it exactly
Yes, okay.
come from? Where did it exactly come from? And so the war, I think, is another one where it's so clear that
Because
is.
of course, already at the middle of the 18th century, you had Denis Diderot
Sure.
publishing his
Sure.
letter on the blind.
Sure.
And the students
Yeah.
who are sitting in the room, they are aware of that text. And where he discusses this blind man, but
Sure.
who did not receive any education.
No.
The blind man of Brizot.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's very parallel, similar.
I completely agree now. So it's more like a trend, and I think that the point is that it's perhaps more general. That there is, as I say, I see it I could trace it in philosophical writing, in scientists from the period. And I think that this is just that there is more access to the knowledge of disabled people. That's a bit what I think. But honestly, that's also still a point which needs further research to make it very, to give it really a more concrete form.
Related to the related to education and the criticism about the education of the disabled, I mean, it's also related to the perceived subjectivity of the disabled person. I mean, like you were talking about Denis Diderot. I mean, he had to contradictory view about a blind person. On the other hand, he's thought that through the sense of haptic capability they can be taught. But on the other hand, he says that blind people are living in dungeon, their life is worthless.
Yes.
So at one hand he represents stereotype, on the other hand he wants to explore the scientific capability these subjects will bring.
Yeah.
So they were subjects of experiments rather than object,
That's an interesting, that's a very important observation, and I think that this is also sometimes the case in the early 20th century still, that there is interest in them.
Yeah.
But does it go further?
Exactly.
Yes.
And that's the big thing.
They remain objects.
They remain objects.
That is what you want to say.
Exactly.
So they remain objects in the sense of, let's say, scientific objects.
Yes. Experimentation.
Yeah.
Especially in the case of Diderot, because why did he make use of the blind figure?
Yeah.
It was because he didn't dare to utter his atheistic thoughts by means of his own voice.
Exactly.
So he borrowed the voice of this blind person who says, okay, I do not believe in God, why not? Because I cannot touch him.
Yeah.
But if Diderot would have said that
On
himself,
his own,
then he would be killed, of course.
Exactly.
And even by making a blind man saying that, he was imprisoned after all. So
here we can see a disabled narrative that allows you to speak outside the
outside the norm. Yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, to talk about disability and blindness, because the blind school opened after Diderot and his discourses and stuff, that Piet knows about. The guy who started the blind school, Huey. In his essay, he wrote about why he opened a blind school, what his aim is. I mean, he wrote that we're opening a school for the blind people to teach them, to save them from beggary, but we don't expect that they will be as competent as sighted person, or we don't wish to replace the sighted people. We only want to give them as pity jobs when the sighted people are not available.
But I think that this is exactly what. So the that this is so gradual, and that you have to indeed let's say see something like interest, philosophical interest, scientific interest, the growing interest in art and literature for disabled people, and then moving forward step by step towards emancipation is really a long process.
Yes, yes.
So this is only one very small step in the whole evolution. By the way, what I really want to also, just in general, also an invitation, because it made me think the discussion about Diderot. In the beginning of January, we are organizing a conference in Leiden about the redefinition and thinking about disability from all kinds of disciplines, where Peter will also participate. But we have our keynote on the first day is Mark Peterson. And Mark Peterson is a very important thinker about haptics, but also on disability. And he published, there's a book common, which is called Seeing with the Hands, on blindness and the Enlightenment or something like that. And so he is revising this whole discussion of the Enlightenment about the blind, because he also appears the blind man in Descartes, for example. Yes. And so he's revising this whole discussion in relation to haptics and the whole evolution later on with the education of the blind in France. So I think that might be very interesting for many of you. Definitely.
Is it up for a subscription?
I will certainly send the link to Peter. We are at this moment in setting up the website, so it will be very soon. It's for the coming weeks.
I think this applies to all of us. If you want to be kept updated about initiatives taken within the context of the Disability History Lecture Series, you can send me an email, and then I will add you to the listserv, to the mailing list, if you would be interested. So just as a general comment.
Yeah, and if I mean, sometimes I know myself when I go to a lecture, and afterwards they're popping up all kinds of questions. Just send an email. I mean, on my website you find my email address. So never, I don't know if I can help whatever with some idea or suggestion or whatever. Just.
That's great. I think it's a good way to close this excellent presentation by Piet. I definitely also want to thank you, also in name of Professor Cantwells, who had to leave a bit earlier. She had another meeting starting at 6, so she wasn't able to stay to the very end of your talk. But anyway, a big thank for coming over to Leuven, and I wish you all the luck and the inspiration during your stay in Canada.
Yeah, thanks.
As a postdoctoral researcher. So thank you very much.